Hello everyone, I'm very happy to be speaking with you today. This presentation will take about 90 minutes and we will discuss preparing coding interview with our speaker Vivek, who is the founder and the mentor at CDS Skills. First of all, I'd like to give you a brief breakdown of the agenda first of all. Today we have about 10 minutes kickoff, 10 minutes introduction, 45 minutes we will be listening to the presentation about skills needed to be successful and improved for coding interview. Right after that, we'll have 5 minutes break, then half an hour question and answer discussion, and at the end, 5 minutes wrap up. I believe we'll benefit a lot of people all around the world. So let's have one more productive session. I want to introduce myself. My name is Nurlana Mollaeva. I am the community manager at Goop and at the same time third-year student. Goop is an open source project where we are building next generation community and structure and index the data flow within it. I want to also introduce our co-host. Webinar is co-hosted by our partner Expertech and its founder Vurgun Hajiev. And I think he is here. Hi.
Hi everybody. Hi. Hi Nurlana. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, I am here.
Happy that you are here.
Here with Go. I like Go community.
Yeah, Vurgun is also our honored community leader at Go. Thank you.
So if you want to be a part of the community, you may find us in these social media platforms, and it's a pleasure for us to welcome you once you fit. Our sponsor today is All My Taxes, and we appreciate their constant support for a long time. We also have to remember the code of conduct. We are talking here only in English. We are here to collaborate. It means learn, benefit, and contribute. We are here equal despite our roles and personal accomplishments, and there are no marketing, competing, or selling activities are welcomed here. Now I would like to ask you to turn on your cameras in order to capture the moment. Please don't be shy. All the screenshots and photos will be posted later in our social media accounts.
I think my iPad is hanging. 1 second, guys. I will need to jump from my laptop. Oops.
Please turn on your cameras.
1 second, I need to join. Okay.
Oh, more and more people. That's good. Don't be shy, really. It's just a photo. Oh, more and more and more. That's good. Okay, good.
All right.
Oh, I have a lot of screenshots. Everyone, one by one, people join.
We can patch it up later, I guess.
Yeah, I think I have done a lot of screenshots. We'll post it and let's see which one is the best when no one blinks. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your attention. I hope you will find this presentation useful and I'd be happy to give a floor to our speaker, Vivek. Go ahead and you can share.
Yeah. Let me know when you can see the screen.
Yes, we can see.
Awesome. Let me just make sure. Yeah, I'm the move past the right spot. Excellent. So, hey, thanks all of you for being here. Thank you for inviting me. One of the things that I wanted to share today was how do you prepare for the coding interview? The coding interviews have become fairly popular. I think Microsoft was the company that started this, puzzle-style coding interviews long ago. And now what we have is like every company, doesn't matter whether it's as big as Amazon or Facebook or Google, or even smaller ones, which are like, a startup, and sometimes even other companies, which are not even anywhere, they start asking these lead code style questions. And And I'd like to just dig into a little bit of history of why we are doing what we're doing, and then what we are assessing in these interviews. And then we would like to use that to prepare ourselves better and see how can we present the best version of ourselves in the interview. The session is fairly interactive, so if you feel if you have a question, just feel free to stop me right there. It's much better that way than to wait for questions in the end. We will have questions in the end as well, but it's just better to get the questions through as we get to it. So just a tad bit of background about myself. I am Vivek, an engineering manager at Facebook, and I'm also the founder of SDE Skills. I used to be at Amazon before Facebook, and I spent about like 11 and a half years there. And as a part of my role at Amazon, I've been an active interviewer, interviewing multiple different roles. And Amazon has this thing called bar raiser. Some of you may know. It's essentially someone who understands the process well and can control the process and execute the output. The one thing, of course, people mistake is that the bar raiser interviews are not the toughest interviews. They're not really there to raise the bar of the interviews, but the bar raiser is there to make sure that we are hiring the right kind of candidates. And so they set up the interview process and things like that, but they're not really there to. That's not necessarily their most difficult interview. And I was a bar raiser for a little bit of time. The one disclaimer, of course, is this is a public forum and this is also recorded. So for the record, I'd like to state that anything I say here is based on my knowledge and experience and opinion. It does not represent the views of my current, past, or future employers, because that's what it is. And I'd love to be active in public forums and want to keep it going and keep my contributions going. So let's jump into, let's just take a step back and see why we have interviews and what are they trying to do. So two parts of what is important is they're trying to focus on what can you do and how would you achieve it. And these are two different things. And if you look at any activity, right, whether it is Amazon or Facebook or big companies or even like normal items that you work on, there are ways you can accomplish your goals and you can be successful, but you may not do it the right way. Like you could do it by cheating, you could do it by not collaborating and things like that, right? So the how part of it is important, and just as important as the what portion. And in the interviews, they will focus on these two elements. And as an interviewer, my job is to look at all the qualities I'm looking for and make sure that I have the ability to assess the what and the how part of it. So the what is typically assessed by your core skills, like can you code in a specific way, or can you write a SQL query, or would you be able to analyze a data set, or whatever that could be for different roles. And the how is assessed by behavioral interviewing and hypothetical interviewing. Behavioral interviews is where they look back at what you have done in the recent past or in the past, and the goal there is to see in a given circumstance how did you behave in the past. A hypothetical interview is where they would set up a situation for you and say, this is what is the scenario, tell me how you would behave. And the focus on the how part of it is to see if you can do the job effectively. So knowing and understanding that these are the two parts that are actually being evaluated is something that will help you to think about, like, are you really projecting yourself in the best way, both on the what and the how. Most commonly, I have seen people who are interviewing, they do the what very well. Like, you're grinding lead code, you're preparing for system design, you're doing a whole bunch of skill analysis and skill evaluation, but you're not doing enough of the how. And you're not really giving enough signals to the interviewer to be happy and successful and put a check against, of course, yes, the candidate did a fantastic job there. So that would be a thought process for folks to take away from this training, from this thing. So the next slide is essentially what does an anatomy of an interview look like? How does an interview proceed? Like, you typically have about some interviews are about an hour, some interviews are about 45 minutes, and so you can probably scale this up or down based on where you are. But typically an interview starts with like 5 minutes of an intro, and you should know what your elevator pitch looks like. So when they ask you, tell me about yourself, or tell me about what work you do at this company, or if you're a student, then what do you study, what are your courses, make sure that you have an elevator pitch prepared for the intro section specifically. And then the next part of the story is the discussion itself, which is about 50 minutes or so will be the meat and potatoes of the whole conversation. And then finally, there will be a 5 minutes of closure. And the idea behind the close is for the interviewer to give you an opportunity to ask questions and things like that. And then we'll talk about the closure in a second. And the entire 50-minute discussion, if you look at it, is what is broken down into the 4 parts. Understand what the company is looking for. Like Facebook, for example, does 2 questions in the 50-minute discussion. And in fact, Facebook does 45-minute discussions overall. So it's about 5 minutes of intro, 5 minutes of like the closeout, and it's about 35-ish minutes of discussion. And in that 35 minutes, they are looking for 2 interview questions in general. And whereas Amazon does, typically I have seen Amazon move to one, like almost like 1 hour interviews now, and that's what it is. By the way, if folks are chatting, I will not be able to see it. I just see the chats pop up there, but I can't see the message, so I can't talk. So if there's anyone who wants to repeat the question, like Saka or someone, you can just do that. I'll answer the questions based on the chat. Right? Anything? I'll just pause here for a second before I move on. Any questions at this point?
Yeah, sounds good. I think Nurlan and me, we will handle the chat, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, we are seeing the chat, but we think that all the questions will be answered in question answer discussions where we have half an hour. Yes. All
right, awesome. No, and if you think it's relevant to the slide or something, I can go a little bit in detail as well. So feel free to stop and ask a question. It won't interrupt my flow. All right.
That's okay. Then participants, please, if you have any questions, you may just raise your hand or write your question in the chat below. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That'll help. Thank you, Nurlana. All right. So the thing to think about is in the discussion, right? The discussion, the way I think of the discussions is essentially there are like 4 phases in the discussion, and you need to make sure that you're covering all the 4 phases. And if you don't cover any of them or you miss any of them, that will be negative for you in the evaluation and assessment that the interviewer has at the end of the story. Different companies have different names for it, but I mean, names are irrelevant. The behavior is what is important. So the very first thing is that a question by definition will be vague. So when they give you a question, they're not giving you like, here's input, here's output, transform it and solve it is not going to be the question. The question is almost always somewhat vague, somewhat expecting you to ask for some clarifications and things like that. So cut this number that I'm going to give you by like maybe 75% or something to 75% of the value if you're looking at a smaller interview, like, or cut it by half or something like that for 45-minute interviews. In a 1 hour interview, you have about 15 minutes of discussion. So the requirement gathering would be about 3 to 5 minutes ish. And what requirements gathering is asking the interviewer follow-up questions and making sure that you know exactly what you're solving. And this particular phase is where you would be asking questions around what would be the inputs like, what would be the outputs like, what are the data types, parameters, and things like that. At this point of time, you're not thinking about the code. You're not thinking about anything except the inputs or the requirements. And think of this as like, imagine somebody else is going to solve the problem, and I'm just supposed to convey the problem to another person. That's how you should think of this. Like, you know, if this is like the person who's giving me the problem statement today or now, I'm understanding the problem, and then I'm giving that problem to somebody else to solve it. If I were to do that, what information do I need? Do I understand the problem clearly? One of the challenges is that this is very important. And this is one of the #1 reasons why senior engineers fail in interviews. Because if you don't ask for requirements and you just jump straight into coding and you just make assumptions, and this is a problem nowadays because lead code is so popular that everybody knows what the questions are. So they make all the assumptions without stating it and then jump straight in. So please don't do that. Spend the 3 to 5 minutes doing this, the requirement gathering side of the story. And that will go a long way in demonstrating to the interviewer that you are a thoughtful person and you're thinking about the problem space. And in a real world, if I give you a problem, you would just not run with it, but you would ask me clarifying questions and whatnot as an engineer on my team, right? So that's what I'm trying to get to here. It's not a very long period of time, so don't waste a lot of time asking unnecessary or irrelevant questions in some cases. So think about, make assumptions in some scenarios. Like, and I'm going to make an assumption that this is what is there. And logical assumptions are easier, so just make them. And sometimes you may want to balance that. This is also the hardest. I want to spend a little bit more time on this one. This is also the hardest to do, because all your practices that you do with your lead coding or cracking the coding interview book or whatever else that you have, this requirement gathering section is not something that you practice in that one, because there is all the requirements are given to you in the lead code question. So the process of gathering requirements is something that you miss out. So the best way to do this would be to do a couple of things. One is to take some time to think about what clarifying questions you could ask for any lead code question. And we do have a hot mic. The second question would be to make sure that you are you're also, like, doing mock interviews, which will help you with this. All right, so that is good. And folks, if you want to ask a question, do raise your hand. Don't unmute yourself.
We have one question in the chat. Here is written, Anar asks, how can we split these parts when coding session is 45 minutes but must contain 2 questions?
Then it's like 35 minutes is the total time for the discussion, and 35 minutes is divided into 2 questions. It's 15 minutes for the first one and 20 minutes for the second question. The first question is usually very light. So you have to do the entire thing in 15 minutes, which means that your requirements gathering is like a minute. That's it. So you would ask like 2 or 3 questions, and that's about it, like very quick. So I'm going to assume that the inputs are integers. I'm going to make an assumption that this is what happens. And I'm going to make an assumption that this is what's, and is there anything else I need to do, and just move on. You would have an opportunity to ask for the requirements gathering in the second part of the question usually, because when they do 2 questions, they're trying to make sure the first question is easy and straightforward, and the second question is the one that is more complex. This is like a typical strategy I have seen. So again, timing is your thing. So you have to balance it. Thank you for the question. So requirements gathering, mock interviews, and thinking about it deliberately are the two activities there. Problem solving. This is the area where I think most people are okay at, because they do enough of lead coding and whatnot. And problem solving is the idea of taking whatever problem that has been given to you and translating it to a solution. And here is where you would pick the data structure and the algorithm that you want to use for the operation. So if the question were to be something like, find the shortest path towards something, then you would know that this looks like a graph question, and this looks like I would use a kind of an algorithm, which is like a breadth first search algorithm, or I might end up using like a Dijkstra's or something else based on other parameters. So the goal here is to identify what algorithm it is. And as a part of your doing the problem solving, you will also kind of touch upon to make sure that you have all the requirements in place. Like, for example, a breadth first search versus Dijkstra's, the key requirement is that for Dijkstra's algorithm, you cannot have negative weights. So question to ask would be, are there negative path costs, right? If there are negative path costs, then you need to use a different algorithm, a Bellman-Ford, or even like straight up breadth first search with visits or something might be an answer in those cases. So conversation here for the interview with you and the interviewer is to shortlist and identify if you have all the information you require to pick the data structure and the algorithm. Do not start coding yet. The problem solving is the one where you're making sure that the problem is solved. And once the problem is solved, then you can move on to the actual execution or the coding part of the story. Very often what I see is candidates who skip this problem typically happen to be on the junior side of the world. They would not solve the problem entirely, and then they would jump into the next one. They can go to the coding. Like, for example, the Dijkstra example that I gave it's an algorithm that does not work with negative weights. But if I give you a very popular lead code question for which one of the answers is possibly using Dijkstra's if there are no negative weights, and you just skip the problem solving step entirely and jump into coding, assuming I'm going to code this and that's it, then verify, then clarify, then halfway through the coding, I'm going to tell you that, well, how does it work if it's -3 and you're like stuck? Now you have to go back and resolve the problem with a different method and then start with the algorithm. So that doesn't work. Key thing to understand in problem solving, another advantage or benefit of problem solving is that many questions have multiple ways of solving it. So you have the the super easy way, typically the n square solution for that, which is going to take the brute force longer way of solving it. And then you may have a slightly more optimal way of solving it, like an n log n-esque method. And then you may have a more like optimal way of doing it, whether it is O of n or O of log n or something solution. And sometimes the simpler solutions might be harder to write, and you may not even know the solution entirely. So as you're debating the multiple choices and as you're weighing the pros and cons of each of the solutions, those things do weigh heavily on your vote in the interview. So I'm just going to go with a single question, 50-minute format for numbers. You can easily scale it down to a 45-minute or like a 35-minute discussion for 2 questions. Is like just scale it down. For problem solving, spend about roughly less than half of the time that's allotted to you, which is like, like 15 minutes in this case for a 50-minute discussion would be the right level. And at that point of time, you pick the best algorithm you can reasonably code in the execution time that you have available for you. Moving on to the next
question.
Go ahead.
I don't know who is it. NG is asking, will the same complexity of questions be asked to engineering management manager VSCD?
Okay, so engineering manager, the coding expectations generally does not change for all levels of engineers. Like, a software development engineer at like a Facebook or an Amazon or Google, what I have seen, my experience is that SD 1, 2, 3, or IC6, IC5, whatever the rates levels are, the coding expectations don't really change. If at all anything, we do expect the junior engineers to perform better at some of the coding items than senior engineers because they may somewhat be rusty. Engineering manager is a different beast. Some companies do insist on engineer managers coding and some companies really don't. Amazon, for example, the interview question, there is no interview, there is no coding round, or like there's no round where they check for your coding skills in Amazon. At least was not there when I left Amazon 2 years ago. There's more in terms of like, do you understand about code and whatnot? There was a system design conversation that we had, but no coding round. Whereas Facebook, I have seen there be a coding round specifically for engineering managers, and the level of questions typically tend to be much lighter. And I think it's only 1 question. I haven't seen 2 questions asked to them. So the conversation there is more around, can you find your way around code? Not really, are you an engineer at heart? Like, they're not looking at a manager transitioning to an engineer at a later point of time. So the goal of interview assessment is to see if you can solve code. And if I were to pick the complexity of code, lead code wise, I think it will be probably at the higher end of lead code easy or lower end of lead code medium. That's kind of what I've seen typically, and usually not any of those complex, algorithm specific questions or anything that uses like KMP or Dijkstra's or whatever else that you may have as algorithms. And I believe most companies have stopped asking dynamic programming questions as well. So hopefully that should not be something that you should be seeing at Amazon or Google, even for engineers interview, not just for engineers, but also for managers. All right. Assuming the question is answered, moving on to the coding, execution of the coding part. So this one is the place where I expect all of you to exceed. If you have done your job right, if you've done your preparation right, this one should be like a walk in the park. Like you should know exactly what you're doing, and you know what algorithm you're solving, and you should be able to like simply just spit it out the code very quickly, just type it. So a couple of tips for you is, if your typing speed is not good, make sure that you work on it. These days, most of the interviews are virtual, and which means that you will probably be in some kind of a remote coding environment, like a coder pad or some kind of an IDE or something like that, where you're typing your code in. It may or may not have autocompletes, but the idea is that you should be able to type in, like, automatically write the code and things like that. So that is like that is totally an expectation from you. And this part of the time is where speed and accuracy both are important. So don't go so fast as to making mistakes. You may not have a compilable environment, so it is still like a whiteboard, but you're just typing stuff in. So be deliberate, be careful, be structured, but at the same time, be as fast as you can. Speed is important, and do measure how fast you're coding when you're doing your lead code prep and everything else as you're doing this. 2 or 3 tips here to think about is, one is make sure that you are using well-defined variable names. Don't use IJK. Use the right variables as you go through it. Speak through the code as you're coding, because your interviewer is actually looking for your thought process and how you're thinking about it. People can't walk and chew gum at the same time. I understand that, but you're supposed to talk and code. So that's a skill to develop and build as well. And on top of that, a few shortcuts you can do is that instead of, you need to be documenting your code as you write as well. That is also an expectation. They're also looking for that behavior from you. So one of the things that you can do is essentially just start a comment block and then type 1 or 2 words in it and then put a ... and then just say what you want to comment there. And then you're probably good. And that way, the interviewer knows that you're thinking about commenting, and then you've also saved time. Because if you end up commenting your code as you're going through execution, imagine the 15-minute first interview or a 20-minute second interview, it just becomes impossible for you to do all of that in that time period, right? So to make sure that you are executing make sure your coding portion of it is fast and it's accurate. Use the right variable names. Leverage abstractions as much as you can, in the sense that if you think that you would want to pre-process the data, break it into functions pre-process, execution, post-process. Then the interviewer has a choice. If the pre-process is very obvious, like for example, you were trying to do something where you are just normalizing the case for all the strings, then you can just simply say that's what my pre-process is going to do. And then the interviewer might say, you know what, forget about pre-process. I know what you're doing. Let's actually talk about the main code and then leave it. So that way you're writing fewer lines of code, and the focus is on the real meat of the problem, not all the preparation and the post-processing and things like that. Every now and then, if the interviewer suspects that you actually don't know what you're talking about, they may actually say, tell me more about what happens in pre-processing. And then, you know what, that's what the interview is. The interview is no longer the question that you set out to solve. The interview question now is, how would you do the pre-processing for the data set? And that's it. You could spend a lot of time on it, and that gives the interviewer almost enough information that they need to check off all the boxes, like, did you do requirements gathering, problem solving? How good are you at coding? And did you actually test and validate your code on your own without prompting? Spontaneously testing your code is very important. Do not say that you're done till you've actually tested it yourself. I have seen cases where the candidates test as they go, as a part of the problem solving. They would take the requirements that were given to them or the inputs that were given in requirements, and then they would they'd make sure that the problem solves it. During coding, as they go through, they check micro blocks. If there is a for loop, they would just go through that for loop, just that loop alone, and then make sure that the input and outputs are working fine. The thing is that you are writing a code on a piece of, on a whiteboard or a text box, and very high degree of probability that you will be making silly mistakes. Like it could be a typos, it could be off by one errors, it could be misnamed variables. I mean, you may be calling the variable something in the first step, and you may have a typo in the second step or something like that. These are easily caught in a compiler scenario, but we want you to catch them yourself. An interviewer has seen this question dozens of times, if not more. And every problem that every issue that can happen, they've probably seen it. So you may not notice it, but they will notice anything. And it's off by one errors are very easy for an interviewer to spot. And if they have to point it out to you and then you fix it, that's not the optimal place. I mean, if you can't fix it, that's the worst. But then even if they point out and you fix, that's bad. But then if you find it by yourself and fix it, that's okay. Not making the mistake, of course, is the best. But assuming that you are human, you would probably make some mistakes here and there. So as long as you're able to find it and solve it, that will redeem yourself. I would like to pause here and ask for questions, wait for questions. Is there any? Because this is probably the most important part of how do you apply yourself in the interview, and then we can talk about the preparation. We'll pivot to preparation after this one. Any questions?
Thank you. This is Mohan.
Hey Mohan, how's it going?
Yeah, good. All right. So you talked about the requirement gathering. So my question is, in case I'm very clear on the requirement, is it a good idea that I should repeat what I understand? So you told me that you have questions, but in case I have no questions and I believe that it's crystal clear.
That's a fantastic point. One of the ways of actually shortening the requirement gathering cycle is actually to replay the question back to them. So if they actually give you a very simple question saying, given a string, tell me if it's a palindrome or not, for example. Like it's a well-known question. You know exactly what needs to be done. There are no requirement gathering there. So then you would actually say, so let me play that question back to you. So you're going to give me a string of like non-zero length, and and I'm going to assume that it's going to fit in the memory and all that stuff, like no fancy stuff. And all you want me to do is to find if it's a palindrome or not. And are there any other constraints? Like do I have to? Is there like a memory or a space or a time constraint? Because if not, I can just go straight in and go for it. And then you would just jump into the problem solving, where you would do like an in-place palindrome check, and then you would just go ahead with the next one. So just validating the input and validating, and I'll return true or false if it's a palindrome or not, and things like that. So I think that's a fantastic question. If the question is super clear, then you just would repeat the question, restate it explicitly, and then would say, this is my understanding of it, and then am I good to go? And that counts as requirements gathering. I think Facebook calls it problem exploration, which is essentially saying you're not only just solving the problem that's given to you, but you're also exploring the problem space around the problem. It may not be for palindrome, it may not be the right, you may not have much to explore, but usually after palindrome, the next question will be near palindrome, which would be something like, it's not a palindrome, but like by replacing 1 or 2 letters, you can make it a palindrome. So tell me what's the minimum number of letters you can replace in that string to make it a palindrome. And when that question happens, you would have a lot more requirement gathering to do. So for Facebook, usually 2 questions. The first question may not have a whole lot of requirement gathering aspect because you just do the restating as you said. The second question would be the one where you might actually have a lot more specificity because the question is harder. For Amazon and others, I think since it's only 1 question, the question itself should be harder. They shouldn't be asking you a palindrome question in that, because that'll, I don't know what they are assessing if they ask something super simple like that.
Thank you. And second question, if I may ask, regarding the execution and coding, not everyone will give you the notepad or the whiteboard to type in. Sometimes it is more often that it is a telephonic interview, okay, wherein you have to run through. So how do you deal with that? Thank you.
Even in telephonic interviews, what I have seen is that it's a shared notepad. There is no video, but there is still like, are you on the CoderPad interface? And we both are looking at the same screen. It would be pretty backwards to expect people to write code on, I'm writing code on a piece of paper and then like, reading it out to you is not going to work. So I would be very uncomfortable with that setup. Invariably, there will be a shared interface. The question is how bad or good that interface is. It could be a whiteboard if you're in person, or it could be like a type chat thing where it's a Google Doc is what I've seen it often, which is annoying because it automatically capitalizes a bunch of different things. When I said for, it capitalizes the F, which is very annoying, and it throws me off my game when I do that. But more often than not, it's like a text pad. These days, most companies are able to spring for one of the subscriptions for like a CoderPad or something, and that generally works reasonably well.
Yeah, thank you.
Excuse me, we have one more question in the chat. Are you ready to answer?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
The question is from Pranit Patil. If I'm not able to do good in coding, but explained about the cloud services and project I have worked on, then how do I make that transition and convince interviewer that my strength is in something other than coding?
Very, very good question. I mean, the interviewer will be looking out for that. And one of the reasons why I asked you to like, cross-check all of these cases is that you could do requirement gathering very well, but you may not get to the problem solving. You just don't get the answer. Like, you're not able to get to the optimal solution. I, as the interviewer, will give you the solution. I will tell you that, use a tree and use depth first traversal or something. And I mean, not literally in so many words, but I might actually help you get there. But then you'll execute the coding and so on. So you could do well in one of the areas or 2 of the areas or 3 of the areas and poor in the rest of them. And that's perfectly okay. If you do well in my coding interview, or if you do poorly in my coding interview, but in the next coding interview do well, most interviews are actually selective in the sense that their goal is to select you. So if you can demonstrate coding skills in one of the 2 or 3 interviews that they have, then they will pick you still for the role. Now, if you don't do well in coding, for example, the example that you gave me, and you do reasonably well in both requirement gathering and problem solving, then maybe a different role is better for you. You may not be cut out to be a coder, but you might be able to do better in terms of, some things that don't require that level of engineering or coding, or maybe you just need more time to prepare coding or get better at it or get more practice and come back. So that is okay. But the thing is this, right? This is think of this more like an assessment or an evaluation. If there are certain areas where you're really bad at, then the company now knows what you're good at and what you're bad at. And if that is something that they're okay with, then they will hire you for those specific roles, if any. The problem with the cross roles is that it's very hard to assess one role versus another role. Like I cannot have a engineering interview and then decide your fit as a manager, because I need to assess different skills and qualities for you to be a manager. Like, if you come in as a senior engineer interview and you go through the question, you're somewhat okay in design, you're like not that good in coding, but you're reasonably good in your project analysis and whatnot, I still can't hire you as an engineering manager, because I have to assess your people management skills, your product management skills, and whatnot. So usually that thing will result in a abandoned interview or a failed interview for an engineer, and then a re-interview leveraging the data points from the previous interview. So the specific case you're talking about is sort of exceptions, and each of the exceptions are handled independently. So hard to generalize, but more often than not, companies are in the business of finding a better spot for you, as opposed to just arbitrarily rejecting you quickly if you don't meet any of the criteria that is listed. I hope that makes sense. There are no other questions on this one. I'd like to.
No, we have one more.
Go for it.
The question is from Gurlin Sothi. Do we need to tell the interviewer of all inputs with respect to test case before writing code?
Tough question, tough one. Because remember, your requirements gathering is a time when you talk about all the inputs. And if you spend the entire 50 minutes on just defining the inputs, which you can, if you did that, then the interview will not end well for you. So you need to prioritize, and you need to definitely talk about what are the key. You need to be very choosy about the kind of inputs that you want to use and discuss. And you also want to use boundary values and large values, negative values, and things like that as you're doing your testing and validation. Use inputs that typically break questions or break the program. You will not be able to test for large scale in some of these cases. Like you can test for large numbers, but you can't test for. I will actually try to test it with a graph with 1 million nodes. I mean, you can't do that in an interview setting, but you should be able to explain, like, since you're not using a stack, or since you're not using a recursive algorithm, this thing should hold up even for millions of nodes and things like that. So the thought process is more important there. All right. I'm looking at Norleen for more questions.
No, not yet. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, it's thank you. No, much appreciated. So let's actually take a step back and say, now that is what is that's the game time, right? That's how the show happens. Now, how would you make sure that you are all prepared and ready for the show? So 3 areas that I want people to focus on is essentially, you want to learn and prepare data structures. You want to prepare algorithms, and then you want to prepare on the concepts, the bigger picture concepts that you would need to use. And these are just tools for you to be successful in your interviews. So data structures, again, I just have a list of items here, but this is by no means exhaustive. Feel free to use any book, anything. Like if you look at elements of programming interviews, cracking the coding interview, any book will actually list this out. If you just go Google for what topics to prepare, you'll find a big list of them. The level of preparation that you would need would differ based on what companies you're targeting, what questions they ask. Some questions actually prefer, I think one of the jokes was at some point that 90% of Amazon interview questions can be solved using hash map. I mean, I don't know if that statistic is true or not, but if you don't know the answer, just simply say hash map and you're probably right, or something like that was what people are saying. I doubt that, but that's what it is. Like in many of the cases, either it will be like a graph question, which requires a breadth first or a depth first traversal, or it requires some kind of linear data processing involving hash maps. So key data types, strings, arrays, linked lists, stack queues, graphs and trees, and hash tables. And then there's like a whole bunch of them that you may need. But primarily, you don't need to know obscure data types. Like, people ask, should I know what tries are? Should I understand, like, how priority queues work? I'm like, yeah, heaps. Yes, if you know heaps, it's good. But if you don't, if you're not fully familiar with it, if you're not super prepared for it, you might be still okay with it, but not. Depending on the company, it might be a different equation. Like the levels are different. So yeah, algorithms are, of course, they go hand in hand with the data structures. Data structures are useless without algorithms, and algorithms are useless without data structures. So making sure that you understand how traversal algorithms work for trees, stacks, for trees or graphs, and then how do seeking algorithms work for linear data structures, like whether it is a linked list or a string or an array. What's the best way to seek? Like to seek from the front, seek from the back. Binary search, if you're able to do random access, would be useful. Sorting algorithms, specifically quicksort and merge sort, are useful. Other sorting algorithms are helpful, but not really. In most cases, the way I have seen it work is that you would have a question that would require some kind of pre-processing, and you would say, I'm going to sort to pre-process. The interviewer would ask you, like, what do you mean? What's the complexity of sort? And you would say, I think it's n log n. It's like, what makes you think it's n log n? And then there's a lot more deeper discussion on some of the sorting algorithms, and usually it's either quick sort or merge sort, which people end up using. I haven't seen the other sorting algorithms to be that efficient or effective in terms of interview discussion standpoint. I mean, there is a whole bunch of weird ones like radix sort and bucket sort and whatnot, but very rarely have I seen them being leveraged in interviews. I have seen like a few conversations here and there. I've heard of a few conversations, but not very often. On the concept space, I definitely want you to understand what big O is. Most companies are asking for space and time complexity. So knowing how to analyze the space and time complexity of the algorithm that you've written and the data structure that you have chosen is important. Please watch out for the hidden space complexity and time complexity, because sometimes the algorithm that you're using, if you use the inbuilt sort function of an array, it may not be O of one space complexity. They may actually be using extra space inside to do certain things. Some of the things that people think as out of sight is out of mind is not necessarily true. So in some cases, if you don't know, be very direct about it. Like, this is what my big O looked like. Sometimes the interviewers know a lot more about specific things because there may be hidden complexities in terms of space and time. That is because of the way the algorithm is implemented under the covers. Number one approach or concept to know is recursion. Please make sure that you know how recursions work. The advantage and the beauty of recursion is that it's much simpler to write code when you're using a recursive algorithm. So in an interview, it comes in super handy, unless the interviewer is specifically looking to poke at the depth of recursion and the limitations of recursion. You should be able to write a recursive piece of code like in a half the time as an iterative piece of code typically, because it breaks itself in pretty nice ways. Then the next thing, of course, is dynamic programming. Not often asked, but it's like, I think of it as an extension of recursion. If you know it well enough, it's actually a very simple way of assessing it. So we did cover, like for SD skills meetups, I think we've done enough of dynamic programming classes, and you can find a bunch of YouTube videos about it, and you can also join us for practice if you want for dynamic programming. But it's not often asked, but not everybody gets the memo. Making sure that you understand the object-oriented programming concepts and what design patterns are will help you, not for coding interviews, but necessarily for system design and other interviews. So just having your concepts well prepared is important. I'm going to skim through some of the next few slides quickly, and then we can come back and get to the questions. So from the preparation process, we just talked about the elements here. Again, concepts, use them as building blocks. Practice, you can use like LeetCode as a fantastic data source. Geeks for Geeks is also awesome. There are great programming books. I think I named a few. Elements of Programming Interviews Exposed, and then the other one is, of course, your Cracking the Coding Interview. There are a few other books that people like. I think there's like a Skinner's book called, I think it's called the Algorithm Manual or something like that. Those are all useful, but again, there is no end to it. You can read as much as you want. It's not the quantity of the books, but it's actually the quality of preparation that you do that matters most here. So making sure that even if you cover any one of these books, you should be able to do a very good job of covering the breadth of it. Join meetups, join sessions such as these, join Slack groups, join Discord groups, and then practice with your peers, because practice is like ultimately the key for success in this case. Making sure that you are looking at get to mock interviews. Like assessment is a big part of the difference between success or failure. I was in one of the clubhouse rooms with interviewing IO founder Aileen, and she was saying that it takes 5 to 6 interviews before you are actually at the peak of your performance. So do not attempt like a Facebook or an Amazon or a Google as your first interview out of preparation. Make sure that you go through 5 or 6 mock interviews before, and then that gets you sufficiently warmed up. If you cannot get mock interviews for free, then it's probably worth paying for the mock interview. The question is, of course, how valuable it is and whatnot. Different services have different success factors, so something for you to think about for the mock interviews. On the but of course, you can always get real interviews. You can go and apply interviewing at like a smaller companies, startups, and other places. It's borderline like on the ethical front, because if you have no interest of joining the company, getting an interview with them, it just seems like you're wasting their resources. But I will let you and the company figure out whether that's the right thing for you to do or not. And of course, when you're interviewing, hit the top companies at the same time, because anyway you're preparing for a bunch of interviews, so you might as well. My son is joining the show. All right. So you might as well prepare and deliver get to the interviews, multiple interviews at the same time. The thing to understand is that most questions that you see in LeetCode have what is called a complicator. And a complicator is like a way of changing the question subtly that makes the question a lot harder to solve. Like it could go from an O of 1 algorithm to like an N square algorithm, primarily because you have added a restriction or you have removed a restriction and things like that. So the focus is to find out for every question that you're solving and practicing, what could the complicator be? LeetCode is a linear preparation process for you. You have a question, you solve it, and you're done. Interview is not a linear preparation process. You solve a question and you solve it fast enough, then the interviewer will ask you a complicator. And then the complicator, you solve the complicator fast enough, they'll ask you another complicator till the time runs out. So you may want to start thinking about like, how can I make this question more complex? Or what can I do? It can be made complex by increasing the size, scale, or it can be made complex by adding or removing a constraint. And last but not the least, as you're preparing, please try to simulate interviews. Every preparation piece that you're doing should have all the 4 steps. Like think about, if this were to be the interview question, what would my requirement clarification be? What would my problem solving steps be? What would my coding execution steps be? And how would my testing steps look like? So make sure that you're going through the interview process as a part of your prep every time. Okay. And last but not the least, I think I mentioned this once before as well, quality is more important than quantity. So I know people who brag about 500 LeetCode questions, 300 LeetCode questions, not useful, not good. It's like I've seen people with like 25, 30 LeetCode questions perform better than people with like hundreds of LeetCode questions, primarily because the quality of their preparation is a lot more valuable than the quantity. I'd take a quick pause here to see if there are any additional questions, Marlena.
We have a bunch of questions. Are you ready?
Go for it. I was seeing a smile, so I knew something was coming.
Something very big. So the first question is from Raisim Abdullayev. What is the common mistake in coding interview?
Common mistake is loads of them. The very, I think I described that as I was walking through the process. The most common mistake that many people make is actually skipping the requirement gathering section, because then you are not even solving the right problem in many cases, and that becomes a challenge. That would be my number one. And there's like a lot more, but let's move on.
Yeah, that's good. The next question is from Rashad Farajulayev. Is it good to demonstrate to interviewers that I am good at many different areas and have my own vision how to solve certain problems? Or don't interviewers like that? In other words, demonstrating superior knowledge than my future boss is good, or should I pretend to be just fit for the position? Long one.
Yeah, fantastic. I think it's a good question. I think that the thing is that there is a time and place for everything. So the coding interview question is a place where they're actually testing your functional skills and your ability to code. So if you're able to demonstrate that you can think of this problem in multiple angles and you can come up with multiple solutions and you can pick up the right solution and code for it, that demonstration is appropriate and acceptable. But then if you want to have a debate with the interviewer that, this question is actually very basic, why don't we solve a bigger and better problem? And here's how you can make the problem better, might not be the right use of your time. I think at some point of time, you want to focus on demonstrating the skill that they're looking at you to demonstrate and check the box. And then there are other interviews. At Amazon, there is a behavioral interview side of the story where they talk about your past experiences and your thought process and how you're thinking. That would be the right place to showcase your strengths and your think big and your vision and things like that. At Facebook, that happens. I think there is a specific interview focused on, I think they call it the project retrospective and your skills in general. Like there is a design interview where you can talk about design skills. There's a specific interview which talks about your program management, project management, and your general deep thinking. So I think this is not the interviewer. At least every company that I know of has a charter that they're given to the interviewer, and the interviewer is supposed to check some of those boxes, and then they have like a small field that says anything else, and then they can write whatever. And your goal is to make sure that the checkboxes are filled for all the interviewers. And if you waste or spend your time on the anything else bucket, it won't give you the maximum return for investment. So be aware of which interview needs what, and then optimize for that specific interview. All right, we'll head to the next question.
Great one. Next question is from Pranit Patil. Is data structures and algorithms a necessity for data engineer interviews, since the work doesn't require data structures as much as software engineers?
I'm out of my depth here. Go ahead.
Can I answer that?
Yes, please.
It is actually necessary. I mean, I understand that in data engineering, you have mostly SQL that you have to write, because I'm a data engineer myself. So, but at the same time, you need data structures to understand like what functions you would be calling, and you would be calling it at scale actually, because any data engineering pipelines would be written for scaling the data. So if you're writing any UDFs, or if you're writing any like stored procedures, or or views or something like that, even in the pipelines, like how it is really necessary, not in complete depth as a software engineer, but definitely a necessity.
Thanks, Jinal. So glad to have you here. So Jinal and I we used to work together at Facebook. So absolutely the right perspective there. So even if you're not using it, same thing as like a program manager or someone, like I'm not coding on a day-to-day basis. So why do I need to do some of these things? The idea is to be aware of these concepts. So the level of depth in the interviewing will vary based on what they expect you to demonstrate. So they may not have the same level of depth for a data engineer as they have it for a software engineer. So great question. Let's do the next one. Thanks, Jinal.
Next question is from Taleh Mamadov. Should we write first solutions that comes to our mind when interviewer asks, or take a time and write more optimal version of it?
Beautiful question. This is the eternal dilemma. The answer which I'm going to give is like a prepared answer that I have, which is not the best. It's essentially write the most optimal algorithm that you can complete in the given time that you have. So if you can come up with the most optimal algorithm, which is like super optimized and hyper optimized using some complex algorithms, but you cannot complete coding in the time that you're given, then that algorithm is useless. Just like you will get some brownie points for the best algorithm, but you will actually get nothing on the coding and testing areas. Whereas if you do something that's less optimal, then yeah, you'll get like slightly weaker points in the problem solving, but you'll still get like an 80% points instead of 100%, but you'll get good score on the other ones. And what if you cannot come up with an algorithm which is optimal? What if you only have brute force? Then you'll probably get like 30% points in your problem solving, but you'll end up getting like 100% score on your coding and algorithm and testing because you did well there. At the end of the day, it's actually viewed holistically. So it's a judgment call that you have to exercise at the interview. It's not, my answer is a non-answer, but again, just to restate what I just said, it is pick the most optimal algorithm that you can complete coding. Be predictive about your ability to complete the coding for that algorithm, and that's about it. Let's go to the next one. If there are a ton of questions, let's like power them through. We have about 8 minutes before our scheduled break, and I think I have 2 more slides or 3 more slides, but I can power through them quickly.
No worries, we can shift if you need.
Go for it.
Yeah, it's really so hot topic, Vivek. I think if you don't mind, yeah, 5 or 10 minutes we can.
Yeah, we're
no. I'm happy to be super flexible. I mean, the objective here is for the participants. Anyone who wants any questions answered, we can do that. Some of these things we can take it as a part of the Q&A sessions as well. So, but that's okay. Go ahead.
So the question is from Vasnahani. For machine learning, deep learning jobs, is data structures and algorithm necessary at Amazon or Facebook, for example?
I think I would just defer to Janel's answer for data engineer. Exactly the same concept applies here. So if you require specific algorithms that you need, or like the generic algorithms that we need for data structures and algorithms and big O and whatnot, they will assess you based on that. But from what I have seen, machine learning typically has functional interviewing where they'll assess your ability to use specific ML algorithms. So not as much. So the depth will vary, but I think the coding round is still there for machine learning.
I'm very sorry if I mispronounce any names. Next question is from Asha Balshiram Aher. What platform did you mention for dynamic programming practice?
There are no platforms for dynamic programming practice, but the thing what I talked about was the SDE Skills, the organization that I founded, and it's sdeskills.com. And I think there's a link there that Sako posted as well. So you could just go the sdskills.com/resources. It's a bunch of resources. It's actually community powered, community driven, much like what you guys are doing here. It is free. We don't charge anyone for anything. We are funded by volunteer match donations that we get from Microsoft and other companies. And that's how we operate. And it's a very lean operation at this point of time. So that's kind of where we are. So hopefully that answered your question, Asha.
The next question is, I think, for us. Ariel Richard asks, could you please share us the presentation? Yes, the presentation will be shared in our social media accounts and also under the recording on YouTube. We will share it, follow us and look for it. Next question.
And just quick note, and our website, I also posted, it's open source. So we usually generate to PDF and we put in GitHub. So you can go and clone repo and do anything and everything you want.
Yes,
and don't forget to start as well. Thank you so much.
We have different resources and different ways of representing the information. So follow us and we will share everything in our page. Okay, let's return to the topic. The question is from Sureha Sunkara. Is it okay to ask upfront in an interview how many coding questions I am expected to solve? As you have mentioned, 2 questions in 45 minutes and etc.
So yes, you can, but I think my recommendation will be the recruiter is your friend. They will tell you what the interview format looks like for every interview. So you should be able to use that as your guiding light. So that way, ask the recruiter and make sure that the recruiter can give you this information. The challenge with asking an interviewer is like, I mean, you're just wasting time there. Like even the 30 seconds that they spend answering, yeah, it'll be 2 questions, is just time away from that 45 minutes that you already have, which is short. So, and I think Saka, I just saw your message there as well saying, yes, folks, thank you so much for asking all of these questions. I think if you have these questions, I'm sure others have the question too. So you should definitely feel free to keep asking. And if some part of it is not clear or some part of it you disagree with, it's also a good thing to talk about. Like, I'm just paraphrasing my experience. And I'm sure there are some other varying experiences as well that I don't want to invalidate. All right. So quickly moving around. To this one, I would normally run it as like a 5-minute exercise in the group with at least one volunteer. But in this case, let me just read through it and then just go through it. I'll do it in 30 seconds instead of a minute. So one of the common interview questions is like, given 2 large data sets, the large would not be mentioned at times, and you will be expected to extract the fact that it's a large data set as a part of your requirement clarification. Your goal is to find the common elements between them. So you may be given 2 arrays, and you're supposed to find what the common numbers are in that. Or you may be given information about customers who visited Amazon on Christmas and New Year, and your goal is to find out which customer visited on both days, right? So now the question is like, actually, the question is to find the number of common elements. It's not to find the actual customers. The follow-up question can be to say, can you find the actual people or actual elements as well, instead of the number alone? Or there could be more things around what is the time complexity and space complexity of the algorithm that you're talking about. So there are 3 algorithms here, if folks are not familiar with it. One would be the n-square algorithm, where for every element in dataset 1, you would check if it exists in dataset 2, and then you're done. And that's n-square, doesn't require anything. But if you're able to pre-process any of this dataset, you could sort one or both of the elements, like, and then you could use, for every element in one, you could use binary search to find the element in the other, and that could give you like an n log n complexity, but it requires extra space, and it also requires extra time to pre-process. The n log n sorting is a pre-process that you have to do. And then if you have a lot more space, then you can take one of the data sets and then, like, shove it into a hash map, and then you can just use that to do a lookup, and that's a O of n algorithm. But it requires O of n space. The difference between the sorted algorithm and the other one is that the sorting can be done in place, and you may get away from additional space complexity. So if the input data is mutable, and you have the ability to make some changes to it, then you could do that. So that's like I mean, I've condensed like I think there is like 1 or 2 sessions where we just focus on this question alone for like almost 45 to 50 minutes. And we talk about all the elements. I've just given like a highlight TLDR version of this question in about 2 minutes or so. So there's a lot more questions that can be talked about here, but this would be like an example of a coding question which has some degree of complexity, multiple solutions, and opportunities for you to code and then test as you code as well. So what are the assessments? What does the assessment look like? One of the pieces of issues that people have is that they think that if I solve more lead code questions, I will know more opportunities, more items, and things like that. And that's not what the interviews are looking for. We're not looking at your ability to, we don't want you to know the answers up front. I mean, that's not the point. In fact, we insist that we feel that we're giving you a fresh question every time or something. We tweak the question enough so that it's a little different from what you practice, because we want you to think about it. We want your approach, your thought process. We don't want to know like your pre-memorized answer for this case. We're not looking for instant solution. As somebody asked a question saying, can I take a few minutes to think about this? Yes, absolutely. It's like, yeah, let me just think about this. Give me a few seconds. And then you can do something on paper, and then like, no more than 30 seconds to a minute, because the silence can be fairly deafening in those cases. And we're not looking for flawless coding. You can make mistakes. Anything that can be usually detected by a compiler in quick order, like, missing semicolon here and there, or like a capitalization mismatch in some variable names, is okay. If you catch it as a part of your testing, that's even better. But in some cases, some of those things can be ignored, and that's fine. We do want you to start using your the correct idioms in that case. Like, you want to use list.insert or list.add, depending on what the language offers. And we want you to use like a q.pop, kind of doesn't make sense, but some languages actually use that. It annoys me. But the pop is for stack, and q has something else, is nq, dq, or offer and poll. But different language, I think I've seen q.pop as well being used these days. So maybe I should change the example. But you should be using the right data structure for it. Like a set usually has an add, a hash map has a put, and things like that. So you just need to know what data structure you're using and what methods they have. You don't need to know the exact syntax or the parameters. Like, as long as you are in the ballpark of I need to add like the n number of elements, and that's probably fine. One thing that I want you to take away, big takeaway, is that the destination is not as effective or as meaningful as the journey. So the journey is what makes the difference. So even if I've seen so many candidates at the end of the interview and come back and say, but I solved the question in the most optimal way and I wrote code that runs, and yet the interviewer actually declined or like, rejected me, what happened? And the trick or the difference is the journey itself. Like making sure that the interviewer is following you along in the entire process, and that you're not really taking too much of help from the interviewer is important. And you need to drive the interview and take control if you want to reach the place that you want to be. Like asking the interviewers, video interviews makes it a little harder, but be on the lookout, watch the interviewer, and then keep going to see whether you're doing the right thing or not. One of the tips, which is actually generically applicable for other type of interviews as well, is sometimes it's actually beneficial to keep a look at, you may have two interviewers, not one. And if you have a different interviewer, then what you can do is observe the response or the facial expressions that the second interviewer is giving. Because the one who's actually doing the interview might be focused on taking notes and thinking about what to ask you next and stuff like that. The second interviewer is the one who's already in the same role, is an engineer, and is more likely than not co-solving the question with you to some extent. So if you're on the wrong path, or if you're off track or something, or if you're on track, you would kind of see them nod a little more, and you would see them frown a little if you're on the wrong path and things like that. So one of the tips is to use the peer interviewer, if available to you, as a mechanism to proxy for feedback. I mean, if your interviewer is not giving you any feedback. Quick things, best practices, this is all there, right there in the world. If you Google for it, you'll find it. During coding, make sure that you're listening and clarifying. Every time your interviewer is interrupting you, that's for a reason. It's in their best interest to not lead you astray. So if they're throwing you a hint or something, make sure that you pick up on it. Because if you're going in the wrong direction, an interviewer is going to give you a subtle hint, then a stronger hint, and then they're going to ask you to say, what you're doing is wrong, why don't you do this instead? So you want to pick up the hint as early as possible and get through that one. Work out the solution. It doesn't have to be optimal. We talked about that, where you don't code the most optimal solution that you can code in the timeline, right? That's what the idea is. You can iterate and optimize the solution if it makes sense, and code, test. Please make sure that your interviewer is with you in the journey, because you have to make sure that follow along if the interviewer is following what you're doing and how you're solving the questions. If the interviewer is not following you, or if they're having a difficulty with that, then that's like, then you've already lost the interviewer, you've lost the interview. For whiteboarding, maybe for virtual, very small things, start at the top left. If you're using like a whiteboard system design, just you want to start at the top left and work your way. Don't start in the middle of the screen, and then have like logical spaces around what's on the left half would be for your requirements, right half would be for your test cases, top half is for your requirements, and then the area in the middle, bottom in the middle is probably for your actual work area and things like that. See how you can keep logical structures in place. This is more a whiteboard thing, so I'm going to skip the rest of it. I'm actually going to skip this entire thing. This is like and please follow this as a part of it. Just watch the PDF or look at the PDF afterwards that's being shared, and then you can talk about it. But 30-second version of this is for behavioral interviewing side, not for coding interviews. One is make sure that you practice the elevator pitch, understand what the star format looks like, and then how would you pick the right stories for it. There's a lot of material on this one as well. I generally like to cover this as a part of comprehensive coding interview prep. A part of it is behavioral as well sometimes. With that, I think we are at the end of this prepared section. Are there more questions?
We can take 5 minutes break if you want, to make some coffee maybe to get relaxed. If you don't need, we can move forward to the questions. How do you feel?
I'm good, but
also.
It is for the participants. Like I am high energy always, and it's usually my audience that doesn't have the energy levels.
Kiru, can I ask a question? Kiru,
yeah, for sure.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, Kiru. So Mohan again. So how do we deal like a difficult situation? Like I became a dumb in the interview, like let's say being a weird question like I do not know. So how do I handle that? Like you ask a technical question like binary or something. I have no clue what you are talking about.
So, and what would be your approach at this point of time? Like if I ask you something which is like something I've never heard of, never done, never solved, super complicated. So what's your response typically? Now, like what would you do? Then I can tell you what you can change.
Probably I'll try to go around the other things. That is one. And that is one approach I do. Otherwise, I would say that, yeah, I did not get a chance to work on it. Yeah, that is what I can say.
Got it. I think that's a reasonable approach. The things that I would definitely don't do is like deer in headlights, like stuck there and no answers, nothing, just thinking about it, not even communicating is the worst thing you can do. The best thing you can do probably is to reframe the question in a way. It's like, so if I understand you correctly, you want me to do this and something like that, and then you may be able to change some of the parameters or modify some aspect of the problem that makes it a simpler problem to solve, and you can solve that. Or the other way of doing it is to break it down into smaller problems, and then you go and attack one of those problems. Like this is usually what is expected of you. The whole reason of why the question is given to you in a vague format is for that reason. They will give you a vague question so that you can break it down and solve it. And the whole idea is that, I mean, at least the FANG companies think that we don't want you to solve the known problems. We want you to solve the unknown problems. Right? That's why we're hiring you. If you know the problem already and you can solve it, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for your approach and ability to conquer a new problem that is there. So I insist that you try to break the problem down with me and solve it. And that's the mechanism. So yeah, keep it conversational, have the conversation, and think of this as like as co-solving this with your interviewer. Like how would you, if one of your friends actually has a conversation with you about this is what we want to solve, how would the two of you co-explore and solve this problem? That should be the attitude with which you're solving in an interview as well, and that generally goes a long way. A good interview sounds like a conversation, not an interrogation. That's a phrase that I have used multiple times. And it's not a question answer thing. It's actually a conversation between two peers. And you want the interviewer to feel like, they can have you as a peer in their discussing a complex technical challenge with you. I hope that made sense. There are a few questions in the chat. Can one of you paraphrase that?
If you feel that energized, we may skip the break and please then move to the question and answer discussion slide. 2 slides forward.
That. No 5 minutes? All right.
We may ask these base questions and 3 questions in the comments in the chat. So where would you like to start?
Let's do the base questions first. I mean, these are the big ones, so let's actually get them first, and then we can do the Q&A in the chat later. So
okay,
the
let's
first
start.
question, go ahead. Ask me the question.
Okay, first question is, what are your techniques for pushing professionals out of their comfort zones?
Good question. So I generally don't do that. I think the way I think of it is to say what are my techniques. Like in a coding interview, I'm trying to understand their depth of reasoning and understanding. At what point of time do they break down their ability to process further that information? And that I'm trying to understand, like, when do they stop? So if their assessment or awareness of data structures, like, hash maps, for example, then I would ask more questions about, do they understand how hash maps are implemented? Like, what are the theoretical limitations of hash map? What are the implementation gaps that you see? And hash map, one of the things for folks is that hash maps can potentially result in collisions if your hashing algorithm is not appropriate. And when that happens, there are like ways to where it could, a pathological case, it might actually just evolve into a linear of n instead of O of 1, right? And then I might want to have a discussion about that. For tries, it's a different conversation. So the goal is not to make the candidate uncomfortable or push them out of their comfort zone, but the goal is to talk about what is it that they are, the depth of their understanding of these concepts. And it is perfectly okay. if I can't find the depth, then I think I have failed as an interviewer to some extent. Like, I've gone as deep as I can, and oh my goodness, these guys are way better. And in many cases, that happens when they're like 1 or 2 order of magnitudes better than I am. And in that case, it's like I'd love to hire them just for that. So it's more of testing the boundaries as opposed to the comfort zone.
Good one. Next question, what's your goal as a mentor?
Absolutely, a great, fantastic question. So I have been informally a mentor for many, many years. And now for the last at least 8 or 9 years, I've been a more of a formal mentor in the sense that, I keep notes and we keep track, and we're meeting regularly and things like that. It's just not catching up over a cup of coffee and then just giving random advice at various points of time, right? So that's the ad hoc mentorship. I mean, there's value for that as well. But the real mentorship actually comes from when you are providing pointed coaching with specific value addition that happens, and you keep track of it and you follow up and things like that. So my goal as a mentor is a couple of things. So number one is I want to give back to the community. I've had great mentors in the past. I've actually benefited a lot from that. So I'd love to give back. And that was one of my primary goals as to why I started SDE Skills back in 2010. And then over the years, it's happened. One thing I realized is more like an epiphany of sorts is like around the 2016 mark is that I've realized that I think I would be a better mentor if I not just mentor people, but I mentor mentors. So SDE Skills is actually a community-driven forum where the sessions are presented by people, by everyone, people like you who may be early in the career, later in the career, in between, and whatever else. And we help coach people to be better presenters. We help people coach others and how can they coach others better and things like that. So that has been my thing now. I think my single goal, like if I were to paraphrase, that would be to create an impact in the organization, in the community, directly or indirectly. And I think my leverage is much more if I'm mentoring mentors to be better mentors. Go on.
Very original answer.
Love it.
But what would you do if you were your mentee?
Aha.
Vice versa.
So, nice, interesting question. So I'm very direct with most of my mentees, and one of the things that I've been doing now in the last 6 to 8 months is that I'm trying to see how I can scale my mentorship. Like I've been generally working with like 6 to 12 people at most, and we meet every month or every 2 months, and that's about it. So that's my maximum scale, because I can't keep track of your career, your success any more than that. Like this is beyond my work. I have about 7 or 8 people reporting into me at work. I'm interacting with like 10 more. So besides professional work, like on SDE Skills and other places, I am spending some time with about half a dozen people at this point. And I'm trying to scale it. Now I think I'm at 18 at this point of time. And what I encourage mentees to do is, so a couple of things. Number one is be sensitive about your mentor's time. Because like obviously your mentor may be busy. Like I was not super busy before, but now that I have scaled my conversation, like I have my personal life, work life, and on top of that, I'm spending this time. So the mentorship conversations are no more than like 20 to 30 minutes, no more than that, and it happens every 2 months. So the focus is not about catching up and feeling good about each other, but the focus is on very specific thing that you want to get mentored on. Like if you have a tough technical decision in front of you, tough choice, like, job, negotiation, salary, or if you're debating about like how to accelerate your career, what to prepare, what not, you need to find a way to structure your conversation so that it's the most efficient way to make the most of the time that you have. Now, remember that your mentor is not an answer for everything. Your mentor is an answer for a very specific topic that you have. So being explicit about what you want your mentor to do is also very helpful. And you will have multiple mentors as you go through the process. If for people who haven't read this, you need 4 types of people in your life. You need a manager, you need a mentor, you need a coach, and you need a sponsor. And all the 4 elements, they could be the same person at different points of time, but they will be different people focusing on different things. And the 4 roles are essentially a coach, a mentor, a sponsor, and a manager. and they have different roles. You can just Google the difference between these, and then there's like what they do. There's like a graph which explains like, hey, this is what like skills of a mentor, who's a mentor, and things like that. So that works for me as well. Like, I put myself in the mentor and the coach bucket at different points of time.
Yes, that's important. I agree. Next question. How are you tracking the progress for the duration of career coaching?
Sorry. How am I tracking the progress or duration of career coaching? Is the tracking is actually the individual mentors, a mentee's responsibility. Like, you are the ones who are in control of your velocity of your career. So I expect you to decide how fast you want to grow, how often you want to grow, and what areas you want to grow in. So I don't. One of the things that I have done as a part of my scaling efforts is actually to take away the tracking responsibility of mine. Like, I track my own career. That's it. I don't track your career if I'm coaching you. If I'm a manager, I keep track of your career. So when I said, like, manager, coach, sponsor, one of the roles of a manager is to track the careers as well. So as a coach or as a mentor, I don't track your career. As a manager, I will, and I'm not your manager in most cases. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, time is the highest, largest wealth. That's true. The question, let's refer to the questions in the chat. Question from the Andy. Before accepting interview invitations from companies like Amazon, Facebook, Google, how much time should one spend on building the interview skills? Personally, for him, taking a couple of weeks before first round and then a week for other rounds hasn't worked most of the time.
At SDE skills, what I have seen is, again, it's a velocity question as well. I have seen people who take as much as 6 months from the time they decide to interview to be actually ready for interviews, because it takes time for you to build the skills required and build the mental mindset and attitude required for you to crack the interviews. And people have, and the way that's usually manifests is that they come in because they have an interview tomorrow or the day after, and then they suddenly try to accelerate their interview learning process, doesn't work, they fail the interview, and then they continue the preparation. 6 months later, when it's time for them to retry, they would do a much better job. And at that point of time, they also apply to other companies as well, and they feel good about it. So I've seen as much as 6 months. The minimum I have seen is essentially anywhere between like a month-ish, like month and a half. And that seems to be the short period of time that it takes people for them to do like a full pass. At some point of time in the SDA skills journey, we did have like there was some document floated around. I can't find it anymore. I looked for it last week. Was where we said that there's a 5-day prep process, which is like, what will you do if you had only 5 days for an interview? And then there is like a 25-day prep process, and then there is a 125-day prep process. So, and that was essentially what you would do if you had 125 days for interview. What would your roadmap look like? I think Cracking the Coding interview has like a roadmap diagram in their, I think their latest edition, where it talks about 6 months before the interview you should be doing this, 2 months before the interview you should be doing this. So my take is that give yourself the space, and please push off the interview if you don't feel that you're at your prime. For most roles, such as SDE roles, and even for some of the other roles, the roles are very generic enough that you won't miss the opportunity. If you do it now, great. If you do it later, that's fine. So 6 weeks or 8 weeks later is not going to make too much of a difference. If you are too far away, then it might not make sense. It might not matter. Just go take the interview anyways, because if you fail, 6 months later, you can try it again anyways. So rather than prepare for 4 months and then fail then, you might as well fail now, take the experience, learn from it, and then tweak. 6 months later, you can do it. It's a very personal decision. For some, it might work differently for others. I don't know if that answered your question, Andy, but that will be the answer I've seen before.
Next question is from.
Can I?
Yes, you can.
Go ahead, General.
Can I add one more thing to that? Like, normally what I've seen is like people are so much like involved in the project, and then they don't feel like they are not doing much of the algorithm or data structure practices. But actually, they're not looking at the problem in that way. Like, every problem that you solve, irrespective of whether in some way or the other you're using one of the other things. So for me, I've normally like not practiced that much, to be frank, because I feel like I use those skills, like I practice those skills day in, day out. To some extent, yes, not each and every data structure or algorithm, but at least in some way or the other. So yeah, I mean, if you look at the problems in that way, if you're currently working and like, you know, you're solving some of the other things, you will find that piece of information, or like, you know, you'll start looking at the problem in that different way. Even if it's an easy problem, like try to see like what are the different solutions, what are the different things, and it will inbuilt the things that Vivek was mentioning into your blood, and you would even though if you come up with an extremely difficult problem, you would be able to crack it basically.
Makes sense. Thanks, General.
Good addition. So let's refer to the questions. The question from Cameron Hajili. You said that quality is preferred over quantity. What do you mean when you say quality? There are a lot of questions and there are a lot of patterns. Problem solving requires some intuition, and intuition is formed when you see a lot of different types of questions and patterns. What do you think about increasing intuition in problem solving?
Fantastic question. Fantastic question. I'm glad you called me out on that as well. Like, you know, you can't get to the quality without the quantity. So it becomes a little bit of a chicken and egg to some extent. So thank you so much. I appreciate the question and the cutting nature of that too. It makes sense. When I said quantity versus quality, I'm actually saying that don't focus on the quantity and sacrifice the quality in the process. So if you I've seen people who talk about I've done 500 lead code questions, 300 lead code questions and whatnot, and you're just focusing on the quality and the numbers, and that's not the right way of doing it. There is a method to the preparation process that I prescribe, which is around how you would take any question that you have, and you should measure yourself and scale yourself with that. So let me take like 2 minutes to quickly go through that in a TLDR format, and then I'm sure there'll be like a YouTube video somewhere which explains this a lot more detail. So the thing that I ask people to do is, when you're practicing a lead code question, before you read the first word in the question, I'd like you to note down what the timestamp looks like. You know, look at the watch and say it's like 11:31 or something. You just write it down, and then you finish reading the question, and then you're like, you know, now you're thinking about how do you solve it? Like, what are the different techniques and whatnot? And then you would say, I can solve it this way, or this way. And once you have a good sense of what problem, how you're trying to solve it, write down the time code before you start writing a single line of code. Right, you only talked about the problem solving aspect of it. The time difference between your first timestamp and the second timestamp is the problem solving time that you've taken, and that should not be more than 2 times of whatever you're aiming for at any point of time. If you've spent like 30 minutes and you haven't come up with the problem space, like you need to get to this in like less than 15 minutes, right? So if you've taken more than 30 minutes, stop. Don't scratch your head. Don't do anything else. Just go to the answer. Like, you know, LeetCode has a discussion forum. Go look at it. See how people have solved it, what techniques have they used, and then spend about 5 minutes to reflect on what kind of hints or suggestions that somebody could have given you that would have made you to come up with this algorithm. It could be something as simple as consider binary search, or consider this data structure. Like, you know, have you explored nonlinear data structures, or have you explored pre-processing the data, whatever. Like, if someone just gave you that hint, then you could have easily come up with an algorithm. Take that hint, write it down in your book of personal hints, right? That's just it. You don't have no context necessary. Simply write down a hint saying, consider pre-processing the data. That's it. That's your hint. And then you keep moving on. Then you can move on to coding. You do the same thing. Once you finish coding, once you're done with your coding and you're reasonably comfortable with it, before you hit the submit button or the run the test cases button, take down the timestamp. That is the time you've taken to code. And if that coding speed is more than 2x of what you should get to, then you need to speed up. You need to do something faster and better, right? So improve your typing speed, improve your algorithmic, like, you know, awareness and things like that. Like, what took you most time? Like, where were you stuck? Try to get unstuck on that one. And that would be the quality of preparation. So the way you spend time on the questions matters. Even if you're only doing 20 questions, 25 questions, if you go through this exercise, you will have a hint book of about 20 hints or 15 hints that you just have to revise. The fun stuff is that my hint book is useless to you, your hint book is useless to me, because your hint book is very personal to your biases and things that are your blind spots. And hopefully with that hint book with you, you can go through that thing and you can almost like memorize and internalize the hint book that will compensate for your gaps. So that's like the a condensed version of like a 30-minute talk there, but that's the one. So that's what I meant when I said quality is more important than quantity, and I can wish you all the very best with the practice.
Great. Next question is from Sid. In any interview, if asked question is not known and no DS or solution comes on top of the mind, then in such scenario, how to keep going and make interviewer interested and get hints? I'm looking for ideal best approach in such scenario.
Yeah, fantastic point. So my answer to this is usually around how would you solve it yourself? Like, you should know how to solve that question in real world. Like, if I give you, so one of the questions was, I think that is the question was, I think, around the Google's water fill question, which is basically saying you have a terrain map that is given to you, and you need to fill, if it rains and it fills the water at a particular level, you need to figure out how much water would be retained in that particular terrain, and that is the question. And the way it actually manifests itself is that you need to find out what is the water level for every item, and calculating it is a little bit of a pain, right? I mean, you can't, like, no intuition comes to mind if you haven't seen this kind of a question before. And took me quite a lot of while before I was able to decompile that question. Stock buy sell is another such example as well. So in those cases, what I do is I would say, you know what, forget about computers, forget about that. How would I solve this question? Like, if I were given a graph sheet with this terrain mapped out on water level, would I be able to solve it? Like, would I be able to draw the line and say, this is where the water levels would be? And on a piece of paper, can I do that? If the answer is yes, then what technique did I use to get there? Like, was it intuition? Was I just randomly guessing? Or did I actually, try to decompile your own thought process? And how did you get there? Like, you would be using some kind of intuition heuristics to get to that one. See if you can decompile that. And that results in the brute force algorithm. And then that would result in the more optimal algorithm. So as long as you're able to get to the brute force algorithm on your own, the interviewer will be more than happy to nudge you in, like, hey, looks like you're computing this like multiple times. Is there a way for you to save or optimize that computation? And they may be able to point you in the direction of the right answer. So that would be how I would go through this. And I think there are, I would just encourage you to watch any of the SDA skills videos where you would see people struggle with problem solving and ask questions and come up with it. Mock interviews are there as well, which is where this specific concept has been highlighted multiple times. And I think there is actually a PI sessions, a programming interviews easy session that SDA skills has that I ran many years ago, and that was supposed to be for basic programming, very easy questions. Take a look at that, and you would see the kind of algorithmic approach that we have taken for that. That would be my recommendation. This is like long ago, like almost 4 or 5 years ago. So I'd have to watch it again to see whether that those things hold good even now, but I'm fairly certain it should.
Next question is from Asha. How should I self-assess my logical reasoning or analysis skills?
I mean, hard question.
How she can or he can do it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, hard question. I understand the question. Can you rephrase the question, Asha?
Yeah. Hi, Vivek. Asha here. My main question is, like, while preparation, like, how should I know if I'm going in the right direction or not? So basically, the logical reasoning, how should I like increase my logical reasoning over the time of my interview preparation, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I would just use that hint/angel technique that I was talking about, right? So where you would, like, break your head at it for twice the amount of time at most that you would need to solve it in a real interview, and then once you don't get it, you go back to the solutions that is there, and then you spend the time analyzing like if you had an angel on your shoulders who's whispering the right answer, or like giving you a hint or something, what would the angel tell you? And then you just write it down as your hint, and that becomes your personal hint, and that's how you do it. So I have an answer on how you can improve your logical and analysis skills. I don't have an answer for how do you assess that. So that was my conundrum there. Like that's why I couldn't answer your question. The way I would improve it is by just doing that. Like the more problems I solve, and the fun thing here is that you don't have to do the whole 9 yards. Like you can just do the problem solving and stop. You don't have to code it. Like once you know exactly what the problem is, then you know how it's solved. I know it's an array. I need to sort it. I need to index it. I need to do a merge sort. You're done. Then you can move on to the next question. You don't have to waste your time programming, because that the coding part of it, if you're good at it, then you don't have to keep doing that for every question. So improving your logical skills and analysis skills is actually improving the problem solving skills. Quick time check. We are at 41. I don't know if you guys had a very specific time in mind. I know we had a few more questions on the docket. I suggest we wrap it up at 45, and then I'll let you guys close the meeting out. And I'm happy to answer any questions in the Slack, in the Go Slack group, if people have any follow-up questions.
Yeah, I think we have left, I think, 2 questions, Nurulana.
Yeah, let's go to these. Let's go through these 2
and,
questions. Let's keep it at 45.
Yeah, I think, and we have Garib supposed to join us. I don't know, Garib, to hear. He had also a question.
No, I don't have questions now. I actually love the
Good. Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, I don't have questions.
Yeah, I think Garib is
So
also like.
Yeah. So one of my questions, like I am an engineering leader too. How do you help engineering leaders? So do you have time for that? Because I would love to meet you, honestly. I would love to meet because I am right now running around 13 engineers and I have engineering managers, but we still have questions about team sizes, you know, and like what is ideal team size, and then and stuff like that, you know, like tackling into technical depth, you know, how to do that, when to do that, when not to do that, stuff like this.
Yeah, I think, Garib, my feedback suggestion for you would be to connect with me on LinkedIn, ask the question. That's all. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick note about Garib. He is one of the early guys from Azerbaijan who created a startup in Silicon Valley. So he's right now CTO for the WeTravel. So, and he has academic coding academy in Azerbaijan. So just brief intro that he was early guys for us, kind of mentor.
Awesome.
Thank you, Garib, for joining us. And yeah, thank you, Vivek, for taking the question. Thank you.
For anyone else as well, the same thing. If you're if it's a very coding and coding interview specific item and whatnot, if it's like within the confines of Go Up Slack group, then please engage me with that. That makes sense. Happy to also take the questions on Discord, SD Skills Discord. We do have a career advice place there, so not just me, but a whole bunch of other mentors will answer. And specifically, if you're looking for areas that would benefit from my attention and my expertise or my background, like, you know, the engineering manager, team size and stuff like that, then I'm happy to engage people on LinkedIn. So connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a message, and be as clear as possible on what you're looking for. Then I can find time in the next upcoming weeks for us to catch up.
Thanks.
Right?
Thank you.
Awesome.
We have 2 questions left in the chat. Would you like to answer, or we can end and
let's answer. I think I like Khrushali's question, so I'd like to answer that for sure.
Okay.
I think that one is so Khrushali, she runs Indian Women in Computing, so it's a pretty good group. So if you are interested, and it's an inclusive group. It says Indian, but non-Indians are also allowed. It says women.
Love it.
Everybody is allowed. So
actually, she should be the next speaker. We have a bit of luck of these speakers trying hard time for finding the woman speakers. We would love to follow up with you.
There you go.
Nurulana.
So yes, please. So Khrushali, look her up on LinkedIn, ping her, yeah. and if I awesome person to definitely connect and provide something there. All right. So the question that is there is, if you already know the question. So here is what I recommend in almost all cases. It doesn't end well for you in any different way. Like if you say that I know the question already, then the interviewer might come back and say, okay, that's okay, fine, go solve it anyways. And then you stumble, you will look like an idiot for not being able to solve a question that you already know. And at the same time, if you were to pretend as if you didn't know, and then you just solve it very quickly, the interviewer is gonna look at you with suspicion for not being honest and upfront about the awareness. And if you try to pretend and fake stumbling through the problem discovery phases, you will get found out, because as an interviewer, I know where people get stuck and where they go fast. And I can guarantee that you will actually get stuck, or you'll pretend getting stuck in the wrong places, and you will pretend going through the cases where you should be getting stuck. So that's not work. That doesn't work. So the thing that I recommend for everyone is something to the effect of saying, I have seen something similar before. Like, I've been going through this exercise. You never say I have seen this question before. I have seen something similar before. And I think I can apply whatever I have used there to this question and see if it's solvable using those algorithms or not. And then, so the way you would look at it is, I've seen something similar before. And if the interviewer feels that similar is not good enough, then they will come back with a new question. Or if they feel that it's okay, go for it, then you're fine. And if you stumble, that's fine, because you haven't seen that question. You've only seen a similar question before. So the operating word being similar. So that's the phrase that I would want to do. So that's what I wanted to highlight. Thank you, Kushali, for that question.
Thank you, Vivek.
We have one last question from Andy, and that's, I think, will be the end of our webinar. So how to handle behavioral question if you don't have an experience with certain situational questions which are asked. Example, Amazon has 14 leadership principles, and what if you don't have a star response or an example for those?
Okay, so shameless self-plug there. If you go and search for behavioral interviewing SDA skills, you will find, I think, a 55-minute presentation from me that I delivered in April 2019 in one of the libraries here in Seattle. And that goes through this behavioral interviewing questions in detail. But here is the TLDR version of it. You're looking at it the wrong way, or the backward way. The goal is not to come up with a star or a situation for every leadership principle. It's the other way around. The way I recommend is that if you have X interviews, X number of interviews, you want to have like 1.5 times of that many stories prepared. So if you have a 4-member interview loop, then you have 6 interview stories prepared, and that's it. Pick the 6 best stories from your career, from your back, whatever. And the more recent stories are preferred to older stories. Like 6 years ago, you did something is less efficient than you did something less effective, but only 6 months ago, right? So most recent is a lot more meaningful. Then what you do is, for each of those questions, you prepare the star. The situation is like the 5 W's and 1 H, like who, what, when, where, why, and the how. You talk about that. You talk about the players involved. You talk about the actions that needed to be done, and the task that needed to be accomplished, the action that needed to be done, and the results that you needed to accomplish. Now, once you have that in place, then you play the match the following between the 6 questions that you have to the 14 leadership principles. Each question of yours, like if the question is where you did a fantastic job of solving a real customer problem, that is customer obsession, that is dive deep, that is insist on high standards, that is bias for action, right? So there will be one-to-many mapping between each of the 6 stories of yours to the 14 leadership principles. So you're not preparing 14 questions or more, but you're only preparing 6. And you're preparing those 6 like in a rock solid way, and then you're trying to do match the following. Now, if you are coming up with a scenario of none of these 6 stories are hitting any of one leadership principle, like maybe, you know what, frugality is not being captured here. And that's probably when you may need to reach out to someone and ask for some help, because I am 100% certain that each one of your experiences will map to each one of the 14 leadership principles. And it's just like the quality of match might be poorer or better based on that. So everything that you do in your life, everything that is actually a good, solid story, you can look at it. Frugality, for example, is focusing on return on investment and being very choosy with the time you spend. It's got nothing to do with money. It's got nothing to do with cost savings. It's actually about return on investments and how you invent your way out of limited resources that are available to you. And I'm sure whatever example you have, you'll be able to find something around it. You may need to add a little bit more color or phrasing, or worst case, you may need to embellish a little bit more. Like, you solve this problem, but you may want to say you solved a slightly bigger problem, and that's okay from an interview perspective. I know I'm speaking super fast, but I'm happy to chat more if there is any conversations here.
At the same time, you speak very understandable, and that's really great.
Awesome.
Experience talks.
So if
Excellent.
that's all, can you please change the slide? What's left? Yes, we will share the presentation and the recording on YouTube. You may find all the links there in the comment section and in the description also. You may ask anything what you want and open issue on GitHub. Here is the link and you can find it in the presentation, which will be attached under the video. And please, next slide.
Yeah,
It was a really great session, to be honest. It was fascinating. Thank you so much, Vivek, for your time and for your efforts. It's so valuable that we can have a webinar with you. Hope to see you in reality too.
Soon enough, soon enough. Once the COVID subsides, I'm sure the world will be more open.
Just a side note, so I think we met with Vivek on Clubhouse and I reached him over LinkedIn and talked about what we are trying to do. And then he invited me to SDS Skills to the mock interview. So I loved it. And I'm so glad that we were able to make it, Vivek. Thank you so much for being so open, taking so many great questions with patience and with great answers. I'm sure that most of you folks gonna go rewatch the recording because that's what you need, right? It's like Bible to go to interview and then you will need just go to SDS Skills and do some more real practice and probably do some self-study as well. So, and that's where you should be good to go to the webinar. And any feedbacks, any questions, anything and everything, you feel free to share with us, with Vivek directly, in Discord for SDS Skills or in GOB Slack channel, anywhere and everything. And the reason we use the GitHub mainly because GitHub issues we want to make it as much as public. We know that the question you have probably somebody else also having. So we try use GitHub for that, keep track of that. Again, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you, Volgon.
Thank you, Vivek.
Much appreciated.